The sun was bleeding into the horizon, painting the desert in fire and dust. The world was quiet, that eerie quiet that only the Wild West knew. Somewhere between the rust-colored cliffs and the dry riverbed rode Elias Kane, a weathered cowboy whose heart had seen too much war and not enough peace. His horse, Dusty, was his last companion, a chestnut stallion with eyes as tired as his own. Elias had once been a soldier, fighting in border skirmishes between settlers and Apache warriors. Now, he was just another drifter, living off what little the land would give. But that evening, fate decided to cross his path again in a way he never expected. He spotted her, lying near a cluster of rocks, an Apache woman, blood soaking through a torn buckskin dress. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale under the setting sun. A broken arrow shaft stuck out from her shoulder. Elias slowed his horse, his instincts screaming trouble. In this country, helping the wrong person could mean a death sentence. He looked around, no one in sight, only the whispering wind. "Damn it," he muttered. Dismounting, she tried to move when she saw him, hand reaching weakly for a knife that wasn't there. Fear flashed in her eyes. "Easy now," Elias said softly. "Ain't here to hurt you." He tore a strip from his bandana and knelt beside her. The wound was deep, the kind that festered fast under desert heat. She tried to speak, but all that came was a whisper in Apache. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. "Help me." Elias looked at his horse, then back at her. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant being stranded miles from the nearest town. He lifted her carefully, placing her across Dusty's back. The stallion snorted, sensing the shift in weight. "You take her," Elias whispered to the horse. "Get her to the river, north side. There's water and cover." He slapped Dusty's flank and watched as the horse carried the wounded woman into the fading light. For the first time in years, Elias felt something stir in his chest, something he thought he'd buried long ago. Hope. But as darkness crept in, a sound cut through the stillness, distant thunder, rolling from the hills. Only it wasn't thunder. It was hooves, 70 of them. Apache war cries echoed through the night, and Elias froze. The horizon flickered with torchlight. The warriors had found their trail, and they were coming for him. The night fell fast and heavy, like a black curtain drawn over the desert. Elias Kane stood alone among the rocks, his breath steady but his mind racing. The sound of hooves thundered closer, rhythmic, relentless, like war drums beating through the sand. He crouched behind a boulder, fingers brushing the cold steel of his revolver. One man, one gun, against 70 Apache warriors. He'd faced worse odds before, but not without a horse, not without a way out. The torches flickered in the distance, weaving through the darkness like angry fireflies. The riders were fanned out, searching, tracking the scent of blood and betrayal. Elias could almost feel their rage, not blind fury, but something deeper, older. The Apache woman he'd saved. She must have been someone important. He thought of Dusty, loyal to a fault, carrying that wounded woman towards safety. He had no way of knowing if the horse would make it, or if she'd survive long enough to tell anyone what really happened. But Elias had made his choice. In the West, a man's worth wasn't in his gold, but in his word. And he'd given his to a dying woman. The first warrior appeared on the ridge, a silhouette against the torchlight. Then another, and another. Elias held his breath. He counted at least 20 visible shapes, with more in the shadows. Their voices echoed, sharp, guttural, like the growl of the earth itself. He didn't move. Minutes passed, then an hour. The torches fanned wider, then slowly began to fade as the riders moved east. Elias exhaled, realizing his shirt was stuck to his back with sweat. He wasn't safe, just lucky. He waited until the sounds vanished, then started north on foot toward the river where he'd sent Dusty. Each step crunched against dry sand and brittle sage. The moon broke through the clouds just long enough to show him the way. By dawn, he found the river, or what was left of it, a thin ribbon of water winding through cracked earth. There were hoofprints, deep, familiar ones. His heart jumped. Dusty made it. He followed the trail into a small ravine, and there, lying beside the shallow stream, was his horse, drinking, unharmed. And next to Dusty, wrapped in Ilias's old blanket, was the Apache woman. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached. The fever had broken. Her color was coming back. She tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "You made it," Elias said quietly. She stared at him, confused. Her words came haltingly, broken English shaped by pain. "Why? You helped me." Elias hesitated. "Because nobody else would." She studied him a long time, the kind of look that weighed a man's soul. Then she whispered, "They come. For me, you go. They kill you." Elias looked at the horizon. The morning sun was rising red, the color of blood and warning. "They'll have to catch me first," he said, half smiling. But deep down, he knew they would. And when they did, there'd be no running. The desert morning was silent, almost peaceful, a cruel contrast to the tension that had gripped Elias Kane the night before. Dusty pawed at the ground beside him, nostrils flaring, ears flicking back at every whisper of wind. The Apache woman remained curled under the blanket, shivering from fever and exhaustion. Elias sat beside her, watching the horizon. He had expected the warriors to return at dawn, and he wasn't wrong. But before the attack came, something else stirred: curiosity, fear, and the truth waiting in the woman's eyes. Her name was Ayoka, and though weak, her words carried the weight of her tribe. "Elias, they call me Protector," she whispered, trembling. "My people. Not just any leaders, chiefs, my father." Her voice faltered, and her hand instinctively touched her shoulder. Now bandaged tightly with Ilias's care, Ilias leaned back against a rock, letting the truth sink in. This was no ordinary woman he had rescued. She was the daughter of a respected Apache chief, a symbol of her people's strength and honor. And by helping her, he had unwittingly stepped into a web of tribal politics and vengeance far larger than himself. Before he could speak, the distant roar of hooves echoed from the canyon. Elias stood, heart hammering. 70 riders, exactly as the woman had warned. And yet something unexpected happened. They didn't charge immediately. Instead, they halted at the riverbank, observing. Torches flickered, but the warriors remained cautious. One of them rode forward, an elder, his face painted with ochre, feathers woven into his hair. He called out in Apache, and Ayoka answered, her voice trembling but clear. Elias couldn't understand the words, but their tone carried something he recognized: respect. Then the elder dismounted, keeping a safe distance from Elias. He studied him, a lone cowboy, gun at his side, dusty, tired, yet standing with unwavering determination. Slowly, he nodded. Elias's eyes narrowed. This wasn't an ambush. It was a test. Ioka spoke again, this time louder. He saved me. Gave everything. His horse. His safety. The elder looked at Elias, then at Dusty. A silent understanding passed between them, one that transcended language, culture, and the desert itself. Elias had proven something rare in this lawless land. Honor, the riders murmured among themselves, forming a protective circle around Ioka. Elias realized then what he had done. By risking himself, he had not just saved her life. He had gained the cautious respect of 70 warriors, a feat few outsiders ever achieved. Yet Elias knew the danger wasn't over. Some of the younger warriors were restless, eager to test his courage. The desert had a way of swallowing arrogance, and he could feel the weight of their eyes. "Stay close to me," Elias muttered to Ioka, who nodded weakly. Together, they watched the circle of warriors, waiting for the first move. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, and finally, the elder spoke again, this time in broken English. "Cowboy, brave, yours, life, saved, you, honorable." Elias allowed himself a small nod, understanding that these words were more than a warning. They were a lifeline, a fragile, tenuous bond, forged in blood, dust, and the courage to do the right thing. As the riders turned and rode away, Elias exhaled. The immediate threat was gone, but he knew the story was far from over. Ioka's father, the chief, would want answers, and with him came a responsibility Elias could not ignore. The desert stretched endlessly, sun glaring down, but now it held a promise. Survival through honor, and perhaps an unlikely friendship that could change the fate of a cowboy and an Apache woman forever. The sun had climbed high, its heat scorching the cracked earth and turning the desert into a furnace. Elias Kane adjusted Dusty's saddle straps, keeping one wary eye on the horizon. Though the Apache warriors had left, their presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder that the desert never forgets. And neither do the people who call it home. Ioka stirred beside him, the blanket draped loosely over her shoulders. "Cowboy, leave," she said slowly, her voice stronger than before. She tried to sit upright, but winced at the pain in her shoulder. Elias shook his head. "Not without knowing you're safe. I promised I'd get you to water and cover, remember?" She gave a faint smile, but didn't argue. She knew better than to fight his stubbornness. And Elias, for the first time in days, allowed himself to feel something close to hope. The quiet, however, was deceptive. The desert was a liar, masking danger in the shimmer of heat waves and the whisper of sand. As Elias led Dusty along the riverbank, the ground beneath their feet changed. Small, almost imperceptible footprints betrayed the approach of others, human, cautious, deliberate. "We're not alone," he murmured. From the rocks above, shadows shifted. The warriors weren't Apache this time. They wore ragged bandanas, guns glinting in the sun, eyes hungry for revenge or gold. Elias couldn't tell which. One of them stepped forward, pistol drawn, and spoke with a sneer. "You lost, cowboy," the man called out. "Hand over the girl, or you don't walk away." Elias's hand went to his revolver. Dusty stamped nervously, ears pinned. "She's not yours to take," Elias said. His voice was calm, but the heat rising in his chest carried the weight of imminent violence. The outlaws laughed. "Funny, Don't look like your kind of people would care about Apache squaws. Elias's eyes narrowed. He could fight them, maybe even survive, but there was no margin for error. One misstep, one misfire, and both he and Ioka would be dead. Then, without warning, the first shot rang out. Dust kicked up rocks, exploded in tiny clouds of dust, and Elias fired back instinctively. The outlaws were skilled, but they hadn't counted on his knowledge of the terrain. He ducked behind a boulder, taking careful aim, firing only when necessary. Ioka scrambled to the side, clutching her shoulder, fear sharp in her eyes. Elias shouted to her, "Stay low. Don't move." The gunfight was chaotic. Bullets chipped rocks, tore into the sand, and whistled past ears. Elias's heart pounded. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a test of everything he'd become: quick thinking, patience, and courage under fire. But just as quickly as it began, it ended. A sudden war cry echoed from the canyon rim, Apache voices, strong and commanding. The 70 warriors from before had returned, not with anger this time, but with precision. They descended like shadows on the outlaws, surrounding them with expert strategy, cutting off every escape. Elias lowered his revolver. The bandits were trapped. The Apache warriors approached the outlaws, faces grim, eyes burning, with a mixture of fury and judgment. Elias realized then that Ioka's life had been saved twice in one day, once by his courage, once by her people's loyalty. He looked at Ioka, whose eyes met his with silent gratitude. And for the first time, Elias felt the full weight of what he had done. Saving her wasn't just about honor. It was about trust, courage, and the fragile bond between two worlds, one cowboy, one Apache woman, and the fierce loyalty that could change everything. The outlaws were led away, hands bound, muttering curses and promises of revenge. But Elias knew it wouldn't matter. The desert had its own justice, and today it favored the honorable. The desert air was heavy with tension as the dust settled from the ambush. Elias Kane wiped sweat from his brow, his revolver still warm in his hand. Dusty nickered softly beside him, sensing the end of immediate danger, but not yet understanding that peace in the West was always fleeting. Yoka sat up, her blanket draped over her shoulders. She winced, but her eyes shone with gratitude and determination. "Cowboy, you risked everything," she whispered. Elias shook his head. "I didn't risk anything I wasn't ready to lose." Yet even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't just about courage. It was about a choice, the kind that defines a man long after the desert wind has erased footprints and gunpowder stains. The Apache warriors gathered around, forming a silent circle. Their elder stepped forward, his painted face unreadable. For a long moment, Elias held his breath. Every instinct screamed that one wrong move could undo the fragile trust he had built. "You saved her," the elder said finally, in halting English. "You honor. Strong, but the world dangerous. You must choose." Elias frowned. "Choose what?" The elder's eyes were steady. "Stay, protect her, or leave." But life, fragile, danger, everywhere. It wasn't a question. It was a test of character. Elias knew what he would choose, yet the consequences were heavier than any gunfight. To stay meant aligning himself with a world he barely understood, one filled with rules he had never been taught. To leave meant betraying the woman whose life depended on him, the trust of 70 warriors, and, most painfully, the promise he had made to himself that honor still mattered. Ioka's gaze met his. Cowboy, choose honor. My people. They will protect you too, but you must choose. Elias looked at Dusty, at the river flowing gently through the desert, at the scarred cliffs that had witnessed decades of blood and struggle. He thought of every battle fought, every friend lost, every moment he had walked alone. And he made his choice. I stay, he said, finally. Not for her. Not just for her. For what's right. For honor. Ioka smiled faintly, relief in her eyes. The warriors around them murmured, the sound like wind over the plains, approving, acknowledging. Elias felt a strange weight lift from his chest. In the desert, in the Wild West, a man's word was the only thing worth anything, and today he had kept his. But the decision came with a price. Scouts reported movement on the horizon, another band of outlaws, larger and more ruthless than the last. Word had spread fast. The desert was full of men hungry for revenge, gold, or notoriety. Elias and Ioka would have to move quickly, or the hard-won bond between cowboy and tribe would be tested in fire and blood. The elder approached once more. Cowboy, you fight together. You survive together. Trust, honor, life. Elias nodded. He had survived the desert alone for years, but never had survival felt so complicated, so intertwined with the fate of another. Every step forward now would be a test for courage, for loyalty, and for the fragile balance between two worlds colliding in sand. Sun and blood. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the canyon. Elias mounted Dusty, and with Ioka beside him, they began to ride. The river's ribbon of water guided them, a symbol of life and hope. Behind them, 70 warriors rode in silent formation, guardians of both honor and fate. The journey was far from over. The desert stretched endlessly, filled with danger, betrayal, and the unknown. But for Elias Kane, for the first time in years, the weight of honor gave him purpose, a reason to fight, to protect, and to survive in a world that tested the soul at every turn. The desert morning was eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for what was about to unfold. Elias Kane sat astride Dusty, the chestnut stallion, shifting nervously beneath him. Beside him, Ioka wrapped her blanket tightly around her shoulders, pain still etched in her features, but resolve blazing in her eyes. Behind them, the 70 Apache warriors moved like shadows over the dunes, their disciplined formation a silent promise. They would protect her, and anyone who dared to harm her would face the consequences. Elias had never seen anything like it. Sheer numbers, precision, and loyalty united in one unstoppable force. But even that might not be enough. Word of the previous skirmish had spread, and the outlaws who had survived were regrouping, calling in reinforcements. Elias knew this confrontation would test every ounce of courage he had. Every lesson the desert had taught him. The first signs of movement appeared on the horizon, dust clouds rising like smoke signals, the silhouette of riders growing with each heartbeat. Elias counted at least 50 men, armed and determined, eyes glinting with greed and vengeance. He felt the weight of every choice he had made leading to this moment. Saving Ioka, giving Dusty, trusting honor over fear. Every decision, every risk, had culminated in this battle, a test of human spirit, loyalty, and the thin line between life and death in the Wild West. The outlaws charged, hooves pounding, guns raised, shouts piercing the still air. Elias tightened his grip on Dusty's reins, firing 2 warning shots that echoed like thunder. But the Apache warriors were already moving in perfect synchronization. They fanned out, flanking the attackers from every side. Archers on horseback loosed arrows with deadly precision, while warriors armed with rifles and tomahawks cut off escape routes. It was a ballet of violence and strategy, orchestrated with decades of tribal knowledge and honed instincts. Elias fired from behind a boulder, covering Ioka as she clutched the reins of Dusty. The chaos around him was almost hypnotic, dust swirling, weapons flashing, shouts and war cries mixing into a thunderous symphony of survival. Then the moment came. A group of outlaws tried to break through the flanks, aiming directly for Ioka. Elias acted instinctively, placing himself between them and the woman, his revolver finding its mark with deadly precision. But before he could react further, the Apache warriors surged forward, overwhelming the attackers with sheer force. In minutes, the battle was over. The outlaws lay bound or fleeing into the desert, and the 70 warriors stood tall. Their presence an unspoken declaration. The unthinkable had happened. They had trusted an outsider, and together they had protected their own. Elias looked at Ioka, her eyes wide with relief and admiration. "Did it?" she whispered. "No," Elias replied, voice low but steady. "We did it." The warriors gathered around, faces proud but solemn. The elder stepped forward, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Cowboy, honor, courage, loyalty, you, part of tribe now, not by blood, but by choice." Elias felt something he hadn't in years, belonging. Not to the desert, not to Dusty, not even to the lawless towns he had wandered through, but to something greater, something enduring. The bond forged in trust, courage, and the unbreakable will to do what is right. As the sun set behind the rocky cliffs, Elias, Ioka, and Dusty rode, together with the Apache warriors. The desert stretched endlessly before them, but the fear of what lay ahead was replaced with a newfound respect for life, loyalty, and honor. In the Wild West, danger was never far. But in that moment, the unthinkable had been achieved. 70 warriors, a cowboy, and a wounded woman had shown that courage and honor could defy even the harshest deserts, the fiercest enemies, and the unlikeliest odds. And for Elias Kane, the legend of that day would ride on forever, etched into the sands of the wild, unforgiving land he called home.